China's President Xi Jinping makes no secret his desire not only to disrupt the current world order, but also to install China as the leading power in a new global paradigm. But what if he achieved his dreams and more? What if the communist nation kicked the US off its throne and took over the entire world? Xi is focused on massively modernizing China over the last 30 years, transforming it from an isolated nation racked by poverty into a key cog in the global geopolitical landscape. Economically and militaristically, China is one of the leaders of the global pack, and though that strength hasn't led to it becoming the world's dominant country, it's slowly chipping away at the Western hegemony that Xi wishes to bring crumbling down. So the prospect of a China-led world in the future isn't especially far-fetched. But what about a world that is all China? In other words, what would life be like if there were no other nations, and China controlled every single scrap of land and water on the planet? Let's start with governance. Immediately, many of the countries that now have to adapt to Chinese leadership see a wholesale change in how they're governed. That's because China is a communist nation and has been since 1949, when Mao Zedong took control and established what we now know as the People's Republic of China. Today, President Xi stands at the head of the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP. China itself is a one-party state, with no other political groups opposing the CCP and its rule. The vast majority of the world's countries would see thus a wholesale change in how they're governed. According to a 2019 Pew Research Center report, of 167 countries examined in 2017, 57% were considered democratic. This means that they hold regular and fair elections so that the country's leadership is determined by its people. A further 28% were considered a mix between democratic and autocratic, meaning that they have elements of both. Russia might fall under that category, though it presents itself as a democracy with semi-regular elections. Those elections are tainted by fraud and overwhelmingly come out in favor of an autocratic rule masquerading as a democratically elected official. All of that would disappear if the entire world was China. There would be no more choice between parties, with the world's 8.1 billion people being forced to accept that they have only one ruler. However, the concept of voting doesn't disappear entirely. Article 34 of the country's constitution makes this clear, as it says, all citizens of the People's Republic of China who have reached the age of 18, regardless of ethnicity, race, gender, occupation, family background, religious belief, level of education, property status, or length of residence, shall have the right to vote and stand for election. Persons deprived of political rights in accordance with law shall be an exception. How can that be possible? If there are no parties allowed to oppose the CCP in this new worldwide China, how would you ever be able to vote? The answer lies in how the CCP organizes itself. Though Xi Jinping is the president of China, his true power comes from his position as the general secretary of the CCP. That party has over 89 million members in China alone, meaning a large portion of its 1.42 billion people are part of the CCP. That gives us a chance to do some quick math. Dividing 8.1 billion by 1.42 billion gives us approximately 5.78. So the new global CCP would become 5.78 times larger than it is now, reaching a membership of around 514 million people. That's approximately 1/16 of the world's population being in bed with the CCP if the entire world was China, which perhaps offers a hint as to how the CCP has been in power for so long. Speaking of power, let's return to the CCP's structure. Underneath Xi sits the Politburo Standing Committee, a group of 7 powerful politicians who make up Xi's inner circle. If all of the world were China, it's possible that Xi would expand the scope of this committee, either by welcoming new members or setting up standing committees in each continent. But the odds are just as high that your fate is generally going to be determined by these 7 people. Another layer of protection for Xi exists below the Standing Committee in the Politburo, a 25-member-strong group that includes the 7 members of the Standing Committee. These people are allies of Xi and generally hold high-powered roles in the CCP, the Chinese government, or even the military. No voting is going to occur at any of those levels. Next up is the National People's Congress, a collective of 3,000 delegates responsible for writing China's laws. This Congress has 5 levels, starting with the provincial level before descending into the quasi-provincial, prefectural, county, and township levels. It's here that the elections finally come into play. However, you'll only be able to elect officials at the county and township levels, the 2 most local levels of the National People's Congress. And don't for a second think that you might be able to use this opportunity to bring non-communist candidates into the lower levels of government. Every single candidate has to be vetted and approved by the CCP before they can stand. Interestingly, the deputies you vote into the lower levels of the National People's Congress are then responsible for voting in those who will sit at the higher level. It's a self-sustaining system, one designed to ensure only CCP-approved politicians and lawmakers make it in. As for the Congress itself, it would likely expand significantly if the whole world was China. Perhaps each former country would become a prefecture or a province under the total Chinese rule, each with its own representatives. Alternatively, Xi Jinping might see the National People's Congress ballooning as difficult to control and instead choose to keep it the same size, perhaps implementing some form of local governance for the countries that now have become China. Either way, as somebody living within this new global China, you'll essentially have no voice in elections and no real prospects for enacting change within the Chinese structure. Next up, the military. If the entire world is China, you might question why there would be any need for a military at all. There should be no wars to fight as there are no other countries. But in this scenario, China has essentially taken over the world. And though it's done away with the concept of countries, it can't outright eradicate the cultures of those countries or get rid of people's desire to be free of the CCP yoke. So, the military would still be a force for defending China. But it would have an internal focus, with the military likely being used to tackle insurgent movements and keep the populace, particularly rebels who want to restore their former countries, in check. Each former country would likely have its own branch of the military, leading to a massive expansion of what's already one of the world's strongest armies. Let's focus on manpower. Currently, China has an estimated 2.54 million military personnel, which includes around 2.035 million active soldiers and 510,000 reservists. If we take our ratio from earlier, when we noted the CCP would expand by 5.78 times, we can assume the Chinese military grows to encompass around 14.7 million people, the largest army that has ever existed. This military would be distributed based on landmass and population centers. For instance, India has a population similar to China right now, meaning it would likely have a military of around 3 million. Russia and the US would also have large militaries, which could station themselves in the many bases both the countries have set up for their countries. Fortunately for you, China's military doesn't conscript people. At least it doesn't when it isn't in a time of war. Should localized issues require the use of military force to overcome, China's Central Military Commission could enforce its regulations on conscription work. These regulations essentially give the military carte blanche to adjust conscription requirements at will, and depending on the situation it faces. So, if a rebel army starts to build up steam in the former United States, there's a chance China could enact forced conscription in that region to bolster the local military so it can quickly quell an uprising. It would all be about control. The global Chinese military exists to ensure that the entire world stays Chinese. There is another problem. Once you're in this new Chinese military, it is very difficult to get out. In December 2019, CNN published a piece profiling a former Chinese soldier named Zhang Mukang, a university student in the Hainan province. He had previously served in the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, until he told the Chinese government that he wanted to leave. Perhaps that was a mistake, as punishment upon punishment was meted out on him. Zhang received several penalties, starting with a 2-year ban on international travel. That wouldn't be a problem if the whole world were China, because the concept of international travel would no longer exist. But China has that covered. The ban extended to traveling on planes, buses, or long-distance trains within China. So somebody who leaves the military is essentially confined to their current location for as long as the Chinese government decides. The punishments kept on coming. Zhang was also banned from buying real estate, enrolling in college or school, starting a business, or getting insurance and loans. Essentially, everything that could help him lead a normal life outside of the military was taken away from him. There were also financial penalties. A $4,000 fine in addition to losing the reimbursement of $3,750 in costs incurred for training, testing, and housing him during his short time as a soldier. He would also be publicly shamed on social media and television for what China essentially sees as a desertion of his duties. Oh, and he can never serve in any governmental role for the rest of his life. While CNN notes this level of punishment is rare, or at least it was in 2019, it offers some insight into what your life would become if you entered the new Chinese global military. you better just stick it out for however long your term might be, or your life outside the military might be ruined. That is assuming there is much of a life for you to enjoy at all, which brings us to our next topic: wealth. Specifically, the distribution of wealth and how that would affect your life now that you're part of global China. Interestingly, any assumptions of being forced into a communist way of living in which society is relatively equal across the board and are all working toward a collective good are misguided. That's the system China had in place until around 1978, according to Stanford University's Center on China's Economy and Institutions. Since then, the country has transformed to follow something more akin to a capitalist model. There's still a state-owned element to wealth distribution. Stanford says about 30% of China's total wealth is state-owned, which is vastly different from the situation in the US, where 0% of the wealth is state-owned when adjusted for debt. Still, this move toward a more capitalistic model has also led to massive wealth disparity. Stanford notes that the share of China's national income received by the country's top 10% of earners has increased to 41%. Depending on which area of the new global China you live in, that could be an improvement in your situation. In the US, for instance, the top 10% get 45% of the wealth, meaning a global China may on the surface seem better for the other 90%. France, however, sees 32% of its wealth going to the top 10%, meaning it would struggle with greater wealth disparity if the whole world were China. Still, maybe this means your financial situation will not change much when the whole world becomes China. But there are other problems. As Statista notes, China has no set minimum wage, with one of the reasons being that wages in the country vary massively based on issues including industry, role, gender, and region. The organization also notes that minimum wage standards in China, though they have increased between 2012 and 2022, are still far lower than in the majority of developed countries. Ultimately, that means that the average Chinese salary in 2022 was 114,029 yuan, roughly $15,704. That's a pretty major decrease compared to the average annual US salary of $59,384, according to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. Of course, it'll also be higher than the average salary in many developing countries. Sticking with Statista, it notes that 19.3% of China's population earns under $10,000 per year, with the vast majority, 65.6%, falling into the $10,000 to $100,000 bracket. That bracket likely includes millions of people on a wage far lower than the US average. There is some good news, though. 14.5% of China's population earns between $100,000 and $1 million per year, with 0.6% making more than $1 million annually. So where would this leave you if the whole world was China? It all depends on the factors mentioned earlier: industry, role, gender, and location. In terms of industry and role, you're going to earn more if you work in an in-demand sector, such as tech, and have a management role. That's a given, and it's in line with what you would expect in most countries. It's the gender and location issues that could present the biggest problems. Statista notes that most of China's wealth is concentrated in high-ranking cities. The lower the city is ranked, the lower your income is going to be. People living in the former London, New York, Paris, they're going to likely earn a lot more than those living in minor cities and townships. Again, that is fairly consistent with what we see in most developed countries. The gender gap could be even more impactful in the new global China. Reports vary on the large divide between men's and women's wages in China. In 2015, a study published by Cornell University noted that women earned 71.75% of the amount that men earn when working equivalent roles. It only appears to have gotten worse from there. A 2024 study published in the PLOS ONE journal notes that the World Economic Forum ranks countries based on gender pay equality. In 2006, China ranked 57th in the world, but by 2020, it was in the 106th position, and the gender pay gap is getting larger. It all adds up to you likely getting less of the available wealth if the whole world is China. Still, at least you won't be completely bankrupt. That means you should be able to get food in your belly every day, right? Perhaps, though it's again dependent on where you live in the new global China. The World Food Program, or WFP, notes that China has around 200 million shareholder farmers who account for 95% of the country's cultivated land. In other words, its agricultural industry accounts for a seventh of the population, meaning there is a good chance you'll find yourself working on a farm if you happen to live in an area where the land is arable. Using the 5.78 figure we discussed earlier, this means that 1.156 billion people will become shareholder farmers under the new global Chinese government. Sadly, you won't own the land on which you grow your crops. Shareholder farmers in China hand over the rights to their land to large cooperative groups, effectively placing them in land-based rental agreements. In return, they get shares in the cooperative. However, those shares might mean little, given the lack of ownership means the farmer still can't sell their land or use it as a collateral to get a loan. If you're a shareholder farmer in the new China, the odds are you're going to be one for life. Moving away from agriculture, there is the malnourishment issue to consider. According to the WFP, 150.8 million Chinese people are malnourished, with the impact of that malnourishment meaning that 9.4% of its children experienced stunted growth. Adjusting those figures to account for the global population, it means 874,624,000 people will be malnourished if the entire world is China. That is a slight increase on the most recent figures from the World Health Organization, which says that 828 million people were affected by hunger in 2021. As a citizen in global China, you have around a 10% chance of living a life in which you don't have enough food on your plate. We can dig deeper into this by looking at calorie consumption figures. A study compiled by the University of Oxford in 2023 that examined the calorie consumption figures of 185 nations found that China lands 35th with 3,378 calories consumed daily per person. Countries that are above it include the United States, which is at 3,868 calories, and Ireland, which has 3,851 calories. Other major countries that'll find themselves eating less include Italy, France, Israel, Canada, the UK, and Russia. Of course, China landing in 35th means that around 150 nations should actually see their daily caloric consumption per person increase substantially. The Central African Republic would be the biggest beneficiary. Its per-person calorie consumption of 1,642 would more than double. So the entire world being China could deliver some dietary improvements to the developing nations, assuming those living in the former countries are treated the same as people living in mainland China. There's also the water situation to consider. Worldometers, a group comprised of a team of global statisticians, states that China is second on the list when it comes to the sheer number of people who don't have access to safe drinking water, with 62,717,195. If we multiply that by 5.78 to get our global water challenge, it adds up to around 362.5 million people worldwide. That is actually a massive improvement on the current global situation, in which about a third of people don't have access to clean drinking water. The reason is that the approximately 62.7 million figure from China is somewhat misleading, is that the country has one of the world's highest populations. In terms of the share of population that can't access clean water, China lands at 4.5%, far below the 42.7% of Ethiopia and 44.4% of Tanzania, for example. Assuming all is equal, if the whole world was China, in many countries in what would be the former African continent, it would likely see their water situations improve. So there's a mixed bag when it comes to food and water. Malnourishment is likely to increase to the point where it affects around 45 million extra people. However, that's counterbalanced by improved access to clean water, with a lack of access only affecting around a 20th of the world's population rather than a third. Of course, that assumes the global Chinese government would prioritize ensuring equal access to water across all of its territory. On a side note, what you eat would also change if all the world was China. Rice and noodles would become staples of your diet to the point where you eat them practically every day. Your vegetables and meats would usually be served with these rice and noodle dishes, typically in bite-sized chunks that measure out to approximately a handful. That doesn't mean there will be no sweets. Chinese bakeries tend to carry sweet buns and pastries. Those buns can be filled with all sorts of tasty fillings, including red bean paste, coconut cream, and egg custard. These buns will likely be adapted to accommodate regional tastes and available foods. Still, there's a problem with foods in the new global China that we haven't covered yet: counterfeiting. The problem of fake food is endemic in China. This label can refer to several types of food-related issues, including counterfeit products packaged to resemble more reputable brands, as well as foods that have been altered via the addition of chemicals or products that they aren't supposed to contain. China has tried to combat these food forgeries, which is why it passed the National Food Safety Law in 2009. That law would be enforced throughout global China. But the sad fact is it simply doesn't offer enough regulation to prevent fake food from entering the market. For instance, Global News reports that Chinese officials unearthed 500,000 food safety violations during the first 9 months of 2016 alone. These violations ranged from restaurants recycling gutter oil, old oil that's already been used for cooking, to rice producers delivering products that were tainted by heavy metals. Worse yet was the baby formula scandal of 2008. Many Chinese producers were found to be using a chemical named melamine in their products. That chemical, which is used in plastic production, was added to the baby formulas in an effort to ensure that they passed regulatory checks put in place following a similar 2004 scandal. The approach worked. By the time the Chinese inspectors caught up to the issue, around 300,000 babies had been affected by the tainted formulas, with 6 of those babies dying. There are so many more examples. In December 2021, customs officials seized around 100 bags of fake plastic rice in Nigeria, with officials stating they believed the rice came from China. A January 2017 bust of a seasoning production hub in Tianjin, comprising 50 small factories, put the kibosh on an enterprise generating $14.5 million per year by selling fake seasonings. All of this adds up to a major food problem. If the entire world was China, you might find yourself eating less food, to the point where you're malnourished and you might never quite be sure that the food you have is legitimate. The required regulations simply don't exist. But then fakery will become a way of life in global China. As Dashu Consulting reported in 2023, the country is the world's counterfeiting capital. It reports that U.S. Customs and Border Protection noted in 2021 that a staggering 75% of the fake and pirated goods it seized in 2021 came from China. That is symptomatic of China having slowly evolved into the world's workshop ever since it opened its doors to foreign investment in 1978. Today, around 70% of Chinese exports are manufactured goods, such as those sold by major brands, which has enabled a massive counterfeiting culture. If the entire world was China, that counterfeiting culture would only grow larger to serve the global appetite for luxury goods and brands. Just as with food, you'll never know if the goods you're buying are the real deal or a cheap knockoff produced by an unregulated country that is far more interested in getting your money than delivering what you believe you purchased. Who knows? You might even wind up working for one of those counterfeiters, essentially following a black market career that could prove extremely lucrative compared to the lower-paid farming and military roles that would be readily available. Let's switch up focus to something a little more fun. What would you get up to do during your leisure time when the entire world was China? Your morning routine may change, especially if you latch onto those early day exercise rituals so many in China enjoy. A little Tai Chi in the park might give you a nice stretch and set you up for the day ahead. During the evening, you might relax in a tea house, play a few games of mahjong at one of the many dedicated parlors, or even engage in a little square dancing. That's an activity that dates back to China's Song Dynasty and is still surprisingly popular. Or you can engage in more Western pursuits, such as going out to watch a movie or browsing the web. But the new global China presents some problems here. You'll have to deal with censorship. One of the reasons the CCP has managed to stay in power for so long is that it's enacted restrictive censorship laws on its media, sometimes dubbed the Great Firewall of China. This censorship would permeate no matter where you live, even when the whole world is in China. The Ministry of Information Industry will enact policies that restrict access to certain materials, with enforcement of those policies starting at the router level. The state-licensed internet access providers that deliver access to the web also provide all of the routers Chinese people use. These routers come preloaded with thousands of URLs and keywords, with forbidden variants of both being plugged into the routers at the Internet Service Provider or ISP level to restrict your access to content of which the CCP does not approve. Your ISP will also use software to strengthen these restrictions, and the content you eventually see has been pre-approved by the CCP. Ultimately, if China were the entire world, it would be very hard to find any media that is critical of China because of the level of control the CCP exerts. So where does this leave the new Chinese world? It would be one of limited, some might argue non-existent democracy, in which everything you do and view is pre-approved by the CCP. While the CCP might try to adapt to the local cultures of nations it's taken over, it'll move forward with a process of assimilation in which governmental formations are rearranged. There will be less regulation, allowing more forgeries to enter the market, and you might find that you have less access to food and a lower wage. Still, all things being equal, those in the world's poorest regions might at least see better access to clean drinking water. The military would also become a major source of jobs, not least because the CCP would likely have to shift focus to using the army to deal with internal issues. All of this leaves us to ask one question. Do you think you could handle the massive cultural shift that would occur if the entire world was China? What potential positives and negatives do you see from the situation? And would you be a part of what is likely to be a large contingent that would attempt to rebel against Chinese rule? Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now check out why China's plans for Taiwan are in trouble, or watch this video instead.